Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome back to a brand new explainer. Today, we're tackling one of the deepest, most literally mind-bending questions in cognitive science and systems theory. We're looking at a civilization-scale, founder-grade model of how a new first-person point of view actually boots up. Now, if you caught our previous explainer on death simply being a mode termination, well, this is the essential sequel. We are going to explore exactly how a subjective center structurally forms, right from the ground up.
So here's our cognitive roadmap for today. We'll start with the mystery of the eye, break down the blueprints of the mind, walk through the exact 4 conditions for a system boot up, navigate what we call the structural middle path, and finally wrap up with the architectural implications. We are stripping away all the metaphysical fluff today. We're just looking at the strict structural mechanics of emergence.
All right, part 1. The mystery of I. Let's frame this emergence.
As we established previously, an experience is really just an execution, and death is simply a mode termination. But, that begs a massive question, right? What creates a new I? When a new point of view appears out of nowhere, what actually begins? We have to approach this purely through the lens of systems theory. There's no talk of souls here, no reincarnating threads floating around. How does a subjective center structurally form within a given system?
That brings us to Section 2, Blueprints of the Mind, Identity versus Self.
Now, what's really interesting about this next concept is that to truly understand emergence, we actually have to redefine words we use every single day. We have to separate the underlying architecture from the running process. So let's start with identity. In this structural model, identity is the architecture itself. It's a completely stable informational pattern, entirely substrate independent. Think of it as the ultimate possibility space. It is completely analogous to a static blueprint or a code base just sitting on a hard drive. It makes an experience possible, sure, but it is absolutely not the experience itself.
Okay, so contrast that with the self. The self is the process. It's a highly temporary, completely local configuration of that broader identity we just talked about. If identity is the code base sitting inert on a hard drive, the self is the active, real-time execution. It's the program currently running in RAM. Philosopher Thomas Metzinger's self-model theory supports this perfectly. When the running process stops, that specific self ends forever, but the underlying identity, the core code base, remains entirely intact.
And here's the kicker. This isn't just some fringe philosophical theory. It's a wildly cross-validated model. Philosophy, neuroscience, and information theory all completely converge on this exact structural conclusion. You've got Parfit and Metzinger in philosophy pointing to pattern identity and self-models. Then over in neuroscience, Dennett and Friston bring us global workspace and predictive processing. And in information theory, Shannon and integrated information theory point right to system-level integration. We're talking about entirely different disciplines, totally different silos, all arriving at the exact same architectural blueprint for the self. It's pretty wild.
All right, moving into Section 3, the 4 conditions for booting up the system.
So, how does this actually play out in reality? Well, think of these 4 steps as the core assembly pipeline for a first-person point of view. We have identity instantiation, recursive self-modeling, global integration, and finally, subjective center emergence. Let's break these down one by one. Let's move to step 1 and see how this builds. First up is identity architecture instantiation. Before anything can experience anything, a system has to load a stable informational pattern. It loads the blueprint. Think of a biological system loading a genome or a computational system establishing a state space attractor. This lays the absolute foundational groundwork.
Then we hit Condition 2, recursive self-modeling. Now that the system actually has a foundation, it has to start mapping itself. It begins predicting and modeling its own internal states, its sensory inputs, and crucially, its own boundaries. This aligns flawlessly with Carl Friston's work on predictive processing. The system fundamentally has to know where it ends and where the external world begins. Without this recursive, inward-looking self-modeling, there is absolutely no point of view. You just have dead data.
Condition 3 is where we get the spark, global integration. That localized self-model we were just talking about suddenly becomes globally available across the entire system. This is exactly what neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene refers to as the ignition moment in global workspace theory. All the disparate, localized processing suddenly shares one common workspace. The system becomes entirely unified, coherent, and highly self-referential. It is officially online.
And that brings us to the final condition, the emergence of a subjective center. When you combine that stable identity architecture,
recursive modeling, and global integration into one stable mode, a structural center naturally emerges. The I forms. But notice, I said structural feature. The I is not some physical substance you can isolate in a petri dish. It's essentially the geometric center of the self-model. It is the literal birth of a new point of view.
Okay, Section 4, the structural middle path. You know, sometimes the absolute best way to grasp a complex model like this is by definitively stating what it is not.
So the crucial point is that this structural model completely avoids two massive extremes. First, it is absolutely not continuation. This is not reincarnation. It's not some eternal thread migrating from one physical body to another. The new point of view is a completely fresh, unique mode. It is not the old self continuing on. But second, it is not annihilation either. The underlying identity, that stable pattern residing in the possibility space, isn't just erased because a local process happens to stop. The architecture persists even when the specific execution ends entirely. It's this incredibly elegant structural middle path.
Which leads us right into our final section, Section 5, Architectural Implications and System Metaphors.
To really lock this concept in, let's step away from the heavy cognitive science for a second and use a computational analogy. I want you to imagine a vast global data center. When a new task spins up, it's a completely unique, brand new process. But it's running on an existing, persistent architecture. The physical hardware and the fundamental operating code base were already there, just waiting in the possibility space to instantiate that new process.
And this brilliantly illustrates our next analogy. Picture a massive, continuous building at night, completely in the dark. As the sun rises, a brand new room is suddenly illuminated. The light inside that room, which represents the active experience, the point of view, is a totally temporary, localized event. But the room itself, the grid of the building, that was always there. The structure inherently persists. The illumination is just a temporary mode.
So let's quickly summarize the civilization scale implications we've covered today. Systems have modes that begin and end cleanly. Identity is the stable blueprint, the underlying state space attractor. The self is merely a temporary, localized process running on top of it. The emergence of a new point of view isn't magic or supernatural. It is purely lawful and structural. And ultimately, while individual experiences inevitably terminate, the underlying architecture always persists.
I want to leave you with a thought today that might just completely reframe how you view your own existence. If the I that is currently listening to this explainer is just a temporary mode, a running process born from recursive modeling and global integration, what is the vast, stable, underlying architecture that you are actually running on? Think about that possibility space for a while. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring those structural foundations.